Going Out of Our Minds, The Metaphysics of Liberation by Sonia Johnson. Preface. Long ago, when I was a graduate student in English at the University of Minnesota, I had a professor whose arrogance thoroughly intimidated me. His disdain extended to practically everything ever written. I remember the day he warned us, in falsetto, against the fatuous horrors of the "suddenly she realized" genre of literature. Deeply into male worship, then, a condition that tends to afflict even the strongest women at universities, I was ashamed that any woman had ever stooped to writing in such a concrete and personal, such a silly mode. I vowed that though I was but a young worm, I would forever eschew both the reading and the writing of it. In the intervening years, I rejected that professor's critical yardstick, along with his entire worldview. Of course he despised, and feared, the suddenly she realized genre. Every sudden realization is a step out of the old habit of thought, bringing women closer to the forbidden truth and to freedom from male tyranny. Of course he wanted women scholars to follow the so-called objective model. It would bind us securely to the male-centered universe. He wanted us to stay comfortably and tamely in our old minds. An irredeemable feminist, I recognize now, as he unconsciously recognized then, the revolutionary power of each woman's telling her own story, taking herself seriously enough, trusting her own experience enough, to detail for the rest of us the consequences of the many large and small moments of connection in her life. I know now that if just enough women were to describe the moments when feeling and thought came together in a new way, and for just a moment we were free, we would begin at last, and not a moment too soon, to remember the path out of the old doomed phallocentric world. To recover that long-lost, deeply hidden path and to walk it steadfastly together is to grasp our destiny. Feminist analysis, more than any other analysis of the human situation, has its origins in direct experience. All feminist theorists first observe and draw conclusions from their own lives. All feminist theory results from the transformation of that experience and observation into principle. But not all feminist theory reveals its underlying process, the specific experience, and the analysis of it that led to the generalization. I have thought for some time that more of us need to include the substructure of our analysis in our writing. Feminism is concerned principally with process, not, as patriarchy, with product. Feminists affirm that all women are leaders in the women's movement, which to me means that we are all able to examine deliberately our own process of breaking free. I believe we are not only able but obligated to do so, that it is necessary for the success of our movement for all of us to spin theory out of the strands of our lives. Since philosophy has been so mystified by the men, however, most women genuinely and profoundly doubt that they are capable of creating it. But if many of us who write feminist philosophy of one sort or another were to trace our ideas back to their generation in our lives, we would clarify for other women how theory comes into being. That in itself would instantly demystify the process, make creating it appear as the distinct and satisfying possibility it is for all women. In making our process conscious and visible, we would also provide a model for other women for understanding the significance of their own personal experience, feelings, and ideas, and for depending for guidance on the inner voice. If the women's movement is to transform global society, and this is its purpose, women who do not think of themselves as theorists, or their thinking as critical to the movement, must begin to take themselves, their feelings, thoughts, observations, conclusions, their women's lives, very, very seriously indeed. We must each believe, because it is true, that the women's movement cannot survive without constant infusions of our thought, infusions of those feminist principles we have distilled from our own lives. There may be well-known spokeswomen in our movement, but there are no hierarchical leaders. The presidents and officers of women's organizations are not leaders in the women's movement, they are leaders in those organizations only. We may think that the reason that there are no leaders in our movement is because we have made a conscious decision against patriarchal-style leadership, but its absence is not a decision we have made. The very nature of feminism prohibits it. When women behave like leaders in the male sense, they are at that moment not in the women's movement. Not because we say so, but because non-hierarchy is in the very nature of feminism. We exclude ourselves when we act like men in the women's movement. Because there are no leaders as such, only spokeswomen, either we all take responsibility for this movement, for defining it, for clarifying and expanding our own and others' understanding of it, or there will cease to be a movement. Our feelings, our experiences, our examination of them, and the conclusions we draw are the movement. And the women's movement is the hope of the world. If there ceases to be a women's movement, there will cease to be life on this planet. Going Out of Our Minds is the documentation of my feminist process over the last 5 years. I am proud with this account to add the light of my experience to the growing illumination by which we are groping our way toward freedom and life, proud to contribute to the only genuinely revolutionary literary genre on Earth, from women's experience to cosmic theory, the suddenly she realized genre. For some time, I have been aware that all of my sudden realizations have been propelling me around and up a spiraling path, always and inexorably farther out from the center of conventional political thought and toward one conclusion. But at first I resisted mightily. Every time I came closer to understanding, I backed off in confusion and fear. But since in the end I always found myself back in the same place, I finally decided to stop trying to breathe life into dead and deadly principles and beliefs. I decided to stop running away. I stood quietly and confronted my new awarenesses. Among them, the knowledge that the old methods of working for social change were never more than illusory accesses to power, encouraged by the men in power to take up our time, to confuse and distract us. I saw that whatever purposes these methods may once have been thought by activists to serve, their true nature was in fact always deeply collaborative, and therefore not able to stem but only to add to the avalanche of violence that is crashing down upon us. Then one day I realized that all these methods were wrong because they attempt to answer the wrong questions. Questions that we have been carefully and assiduously trained to believe are the only relevant questions. How can we get our national leaders to change their behavior? What can we do about the state of the world? I concluded that there is really only one question that can direct us in changing the world, and that it is neither of these. To reach a place in our thinking where this question occurs to us of itself, and we understand its centrality to the survival of life on Earth, we must abandon the present global mind that has failed us all utterly. Since truth is reversed in patriarchy, to go out of our minds is to become most truly sane. Then, each remembering our own divinity, relearning the powers that preceded the split atom, the powers that raised the stones at Stonehenge, we can leave behind us the terror and despair of the old world. We can remember and act, in time, on the metaphysical equivalent of E equals mc squared. I offer this account of my own ideological/political/spiritual journey, deliberately and passionately full of "suddenly I realized," as a map for exploring women's part in healing the sick, despairing mind of the world, and bringing it to deepest sanity. My journey has brought me repeatedly up against the limits of my own outer reactive powers, and directed me steadfastly inward. In chronicling it, I celebrate my womanliness, my trust in my own heart, my growing ability to hear my own voice and to obey it. I celebrate all who dare reject the little that is sure for the hazardous cliff face and the promised land, all life, all hope, all that still shines and sings in the gathering storm. I celebrate with my story the shattering of the father stars and the rising of the race.